We can hire 3 junior engineers for your salary, he smirked during my termination meeting. Nothing personal, just cost cutting. My name is James Hale, 54 years old, senior systems engineer at Belmont Real Estate for 17 years. I'd built their entire infrastructure from scratch, architected every expansion, kept everything running so smoothly that the executives forgot how much the company depended on me until they decided they couldn't afford me anymore. I sat across from Simon Knight, the new chief technology officer, who'd been with the company for 6 months. He was 40, wore high-end glasses, and had an MBA from Harvard. He'd been brought in to modernize operations, which apparently meant cutting the most experienced staff first. The severance package is generous, said Anne from Human Resources, sliding a folder across the table. 2 months' salary plus your accrued vacation time. I nodded, took the folder, and said, "Thank you." "Is that all you have to say?" Simon looked almost disappointed. Maybe he'd expected me to argue or threaten legal action, give him something to tell the board about how difficult I was. "Would you like me to say something? Most people in your position have questions, concerns," I shrugged. "Seems pretty straightforward to me." Simon exchanged glances with Anne, who looked equally perplexed by my calm. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't calm, I was just done. "There's a difference. Well, we'd appreciate your help with the transition," Simon continued. "The new engineering team will need some guidance on the system architecture, perhaps a consulting arrangement for a few weeks." "I'll think about it," I said, knowing I wouldn't. We shook hands. I cleared out my desk without complaint. 17 years of work fit into a single cardboard box. I nodded goodbye to a few colleagues who looked away awkwardly, afraid the same fate awaited them. As I walked to my truck in the parking garage, my phone buzzed. A text from Eric, the database administrator I'd hired 10 years ago. "This is Jim, the whole team's freaking out." I didn't respond. At home, I sat on my deck overlooking Lake Michigan, nursing a glass of bourbon, watching the sunset paint the water copper. My wife Sarah placed a hand on my shoulder. "What will you do now?" I shrugged. "Something will turn up." What Simon didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn, was that I hadn't just built their systems. I had custom-coded large sections myself with minimal documentation because the company had always refused to fund a proper documentation team. Only I understood the deep redundancies, the hidden security layers, the intricate network architecture, and I wasn't planning to explain it to anyone now. I started at Belmont Real Estate back when it was called Riverstone Properties, a small real estate management firm with 5 apartment complexes and a dozen employees. Their entire IT infrastructure consisted of 2 desktop computers, a fax machine, and a dial-up internet connection. The owner, Thomas Rivers, hired me away from a consulting gig in Chicago. "We're expanding," he told me. "Need someone who can build us something solid." Over 17 years, I turned that rudimentary setup into an integrated property management system that handled everything from tenant applications and background checks to automated maintenance requests and rent collection across 70 properties in 5 states. I'd built it piece by piece, adapting, upgrading, refining as the company grew. When Thomas retired 6 years ago, his son Bradley sold the company to a private equity firm that rebranded it as Belmont Real Estate. They kept me on, impressed by what I'd built, but things began to change. New executives, new priorities. Quarterly targets became more important than long-term stability. My warning signs came gradually. First, they rejected my proposal for a documentation team, too expensive, they said. "We'll get to it next quarter." That quarter never came. Then they started bringing in consultants, young MBA types who talked about disrupting property management and leveraging cloud solutions. They'd sit through my explanations of our system architecture with glazed eyes, then recommend off-the-shelf solutions that wouldn't integrate with our custom infrastructure. I kept pushing back, explaining why their approach wouldn't work, showing them the custom code that made our system unique. Eventually, they stopped inviting me to planning meetings. Sarah noticed it before I did. They're pushing you out, she said one night over dinner. You need to prepare. I brushed her off. They need me. No one else understands how the whole system works together. That might be exactly the problem, she replied. 6 months ago, they hired Simon Knight as the new CTO. He came from a banking software company and immediately started talking about standardization and legacy system replacement. He hired 3 junior engineers fresh out of college, had them shadowing me, asking questions about the system. I answered their questions, but I knew they weren't grasping the complexities. How could they? It had taken me years to build those systems, to understand the interdependencies, to create the redundancies that kept everything running smoothly when problems arose. The next few weeks were tense. Every day felt like a countdown. I watched as the new team of junior engineers took over pieces of my work. Their lack of experience showed, and I could feel the company's future slowly unraveling. It wasn't long before the first major issue arose. The tenant portal crashed. The entire company was thrown into disarray, and they had no idea how to fix it. It was their first major failure, and it would set the stage for what was to come. I received a call from Simon late one evening. "James, we have a situation," he said. "The system is down, and the team can't seem to figure out what's wrong. We need your expertise." I hesitated. It was clear they were already struggling, but I wasn't sure I wanted to get involved. However, something inside me told me I had to help them understand the gravity of what they were dealing with. "Okay," I finally said, "I'll help. But this is going to take time." The next day, I spent hours with the team, walking them through the intricacies of the system I had built. I could see their frustration as they failed to grasp the connections, the logic, the sheer complexity of what I'd done. I realized they would never fully understand it, not without years of experience. But that didn't matter now. The cracks were starting to show. The system was failing, and it wasn't just the tenant portal. Maintenance requests weren't being processed correctly, and rent payments were being missed. The issues mounted quickly, and the pressure was mounting on the new team. Simon called again, his voice tight with stress. "We're losing clients, James," he admitted. "People are angry. Can you help us fix this?" I could hear the desperation in his voice, but it didn't matter. It was too late. They had made their decision, and now they had to face the consequences. Meanwhile, I had been quietly exploring my options. It was clear I wasn't going to get any satisfaction from Belmont. I had been too valuable to be cast aside, and yet they had done just that. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. One evening, as I was sitting on the deck again, watching the sunset, Sarah placed a glass of wine in front of me. "You're thinking about what's next, aren't you?" she asked gently. "I am," I said. "But I don't want to jump into something without the right fit." The next day, I received an unexpected email. It was from a competitor, Devlin Systems, a regional property management company that had been expanding rapidly. They had heard about the issues at Belmont and were interested in talking. I set up a meeting for the next day. The meeting was held at a quiet cafe in downtown Chicago. I arrived early, the cool breeze of early fall wrapping around me as I walked in. Lawrence Devlin, the director of technology at the company, was already seated at a corner table. His demeanor was calm, almost welcoming, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. He had that look of someone who'd seen everything, the kind of person who had the patience to wait for the right opportunity. "James," he said with a firm handshake, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you. We've heard a lot about your work at Belmont. Your system is legendary in the industry." I couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and bitterness at his words. Legendary, yes. But at what cost? And why was it all falling apart now? "Thank you, Lawrence," I replied. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. What's on your mind?" "We've been following the situation at Belmont," Lawrence said, settling into his seat. "It's unfortunate, but we think it's an opportunity. We're looking to expand our property management infrastructure, and we could use someone with your experience." I leaned forward, intrigued. "What exactly are you offering?" Full control over our systems upgrade, Lawrence said. We're not looking for off-the-shelf solutions. We want someone who can build something sustainable, something that won't break when we scale. I'm prepared to offer you the role of Chief Systems Architect. We'll match your salary and provide stock options and benefits. How does that sound? I was stunned. After everything at Belmont, I wasn't expecting such a straightforward offer. You've done your research. We have, Lawrence nodded. We don't want to make the same mistakes Belmont did. Their approach was flawed, and it's costing them dearly. We're ready to build something better, and we want you to lead the charge. I thought for a moment. The offer was tempting, but it wasn't just about the job. It was about proving that I was still valuable, that my expertise was worth something. At Belmont, I had been sidelined, my contributions underestimated. But here, with Devlin, it felt like a chance to build something that would truly last. I'm in, I said finally. But I have one condition. Lawrence raised an eyebrow. What's that? We build it the right way, I replied. I'll need full documentation, proper training for the team, and no cutting corners. That's the only way I'll join. Lawrence smiled. You've got it. We don't want to make the same mistakes. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I started at Devlin Systems, and right away, I could see the difference. The team was motivated, eager to learn, and most importantly, they respected the idea of doing things right. We began to map out a new system, one that would not only support Devlin's current needs but would be scalable enough to handle future growth. But the shadow of Belmont loomed over me. As I settled into my new role, the calls from Simon Knight and Anne from Human Resources kept coming. They were increasingly desperate. The system was still down, and despite bringing in expensive consultants, they couldn't get it back on track. One evening, I received another call from Simon. James, he said, his voice strained. We need you. The system is a mess. Maintenance requests aren't processing, rent payments aren't being tracked, and tenants are furious. We're losing clients. I know you said you wouldn't help, but this is getting out of hand. Can you just come back for a little while? We're willing to pay you anything. I didn't respond right away. I could hear the desperation in Simon's voice, but it didn't matter. They had made their decision, and now they were paying the price. I deleted the voicemail and went back to my work at Devlin. But the calls didn't stop. Every day, I received more messages, each one more frantic than the last. I could feel the pressure mounting on Simon and the team at Belmont, but I refused to get involved. They hadn't respected me when I was there, and now they were reaping the consequences of their choices. One afternoon, as I was sitting in my office at Devlin, Sarah called me. James, I think you need to know something, she said. I've been talking to some of the old staff at Belmont. They're all leaving. Eric, the database admin, left last week. They're all jumping ship, and Belmont is in chaos. I sighed, feeling a sense of relief mixed with sorrow. It wasn't about revenge, it was about the realization that everything I had built was falling apart because of a lack of respect. 2 weeks later, I received an email that changed everything. It was from Eric. The subject line simply read, "They're selling." I opened it. James, I know you've been away, but I think you need to know this. Belmont is in talks with a private equity firm to sell the company. They've been planning this for months. The goal was always to make it look good for the sale, cut costs, get rid of senior staff, make everything look streamlined and profitable. But now it's all falling apart. The system is down, they've lost access to critical data, and the board is scrambling. I couldn't believe it. They were selling Belmont? After everything that had happened, after all the damage done, they were going to cash out and leave the mess behind? I forwarded the email to Lawrence. This could be an opportunity, I said. But we'll have to act fast. Lawrence agreed. Let's see if we can get ahead of this. If Belmont's reputation is going to take a hit, we can capitalize on it. If we manage to take on their clients, we could expand rapidly. The idea of getting involved in a potential acquisition was both exciting and nerve-wracking. If we succeeded, it would solidify Devlin's position as a serious contender in the property management industry. But if we failed, it could hurt both companies. I met with Lawrence the following week to discuss our next steps. We need to be ready for anything, I said. If the acquisition goes through, we'll need a solid plan to integrate their systems into ours. We can't afford to make the same mistakes they did. Lawrence nodded. I agree, but we need to be careful. If Belmont's management is as chaotic as we think, we might need to pull some of their clients over to us quickly. They won't last long with their system in disarray. 2 weeks later, the negotiations for Belmont's sale began to move forward. The private equity firm was eager to purchase the company, eager to make their investment look good for a quick profit. But the mess at Belmont was undeniable. As Eric had warned, the systems were down, and things weren't improving. My phone kept buzzing with updates from Simon, pleading for my help. I ignored each call, but it was getting harder to stay detached. The company I had built was crumbling, and while I felt no satisfaction from it, there was a deep sense of clarity. I had left, and they had been the ones who misjudged my value. I sat with Lawrence at Devlin Systems, reviewing the situation. We were preparing for the potential acquisition of Belmont's clients and assets. Lawrence was optimistic, but I was cautious. Belmont had been a juggernaut in its industry for years, and the remnants of their legacy could either be a gold mine or a disaster. We'll need to move quickly, Lawrence said, pacing the room. If the acquisition goes through, we need to be ready. But there's no telling how long Belmont's clients will stay loyal with all these issues. They've been losing clients left and right, and Westbrook Properties, their biggest client, is on the verge of walking out. Westbrook's departure could be the nail in the coffin, I said, deep in thought. But if we can offer them something better, something stable, we can capture their market share. Belmont couldn't handle it, but we can. We need a flawless integration plan. Lawrence paused and nodded. I've already spoken to the board. If we manage to take on Belmont's clients, it will be a game changer. We'll need to offer them a system that works and can scale, but we must avoid making the same mistakes Belmont did. I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. The stakes had never been higher. I wasn't just building another system, this was a second chance. A chance to prove that my vision of doing things right, with documentation, proper training, and a clear strategy, was the way forward. And, if all went well, it would give Devlin the competitive edge they had been looking for. The next few weeks were a blur. Devlin Systems was working at full speed, hiring engineers, expanding infrastructure, and preparing for the possible acquisition of Belmont's clients. I was put in charge of the integration process, an enormous responsibility, but one that felt right. For the first time in months, I felt like I was doing work that mattered. Then the call came. It was from Bradley Rivers, Thomas Rivers' son, who had sold the company to the private equity firm. He had always been a quiet presence at Belmont, but now, he seemed desperate. James, he said, his voice tense, I need to talk. The board's pushing for the sale, but I can't go down with this ship. Belmont's reputation is ruined. You were the heart of that company, and now it's falling apart. I want to apologize for everything. His apology was unexpected. Bradley had always been too quiet to ever express regret about anything. Yet, his voice trembled with sincerity. They're making a mistake, he continued. They've put the company in jeopardy by cutting corners. I know it's too late to fix things, but I need your help. I can't let Belmont die like this. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I hadn't expected this from Bradley. I had no loyalty to Belmont anymore, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that helping him might be the right thing to do. How can I help? I asked. Cautiously. I need you to meet with the board, he said. We need to convince them to sell at a fair price, but we also need someone like you to salvage what's left. Belmont is more than just a company, it's a legacy. We need you to guide us through the transition. I was torn. My first instinct was to shut him out. I had already left. Belmont had fired me, and now they were reaping what they sowed. But something inside me kept me on the phone. I'll think about it, I said, ending the call. The next day, I found myself sitting in front of the Belmont board, the same people who had turned their backs on me. Bradley sat at the head of the table, his face grim. "James," Simon began, his voice filled with frustration, "we need you. We've tried everything, and nothing is working. The systems are failing, and clients are leaving. We can't turn this around without your expertise." I looked around the table. The faces of the executives who had once been so confident now appeared uncertain. There was no arrogance, no superiority. They were just desperate. "You made your decision years ago," I said, my voice calm. "You chose to cut costs, to get rid of the people who built this company. Now you're seeing the consequences of those decisions." Bradley looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable. "I know," he said. "I know. But we need you now. Please, help us fix this." I thought about it for a moment. My work at Devlin was going well, and I was on track to build something better, something that would last. But there was still a piece of me that cared about the legacy I had left behind at Belmont. "I'll help," I said finally. "But on my terms. You will listen to me this time. No more cutting corners. No more shortcuts." Simon, Anne, and the others nodded, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They didn't truly understand what it would take to fix what had been broken. But I wasn't there to save them. I was there to make sure that the lessons I had learned were not lost. Over the next few months, I worked tirelessly to help Belmont transition into the future. It wasn't easy. The system was a mess, and every day brought new challenges. But with each challenge came progress. I implemented a detailed documentation process, created training programs for the staff, and slowly but surely, the system began to function again. Simon and the others were forced to admit that the custom infrastructure I had built was more robust than they had ever realized. The off-the-shelf solutions they had pushed for were no match for the system I had designed. By the time the acquisition deal was finalized, I had turned Belmont's disaster into a success. The company was sold at a fair price, and I had ensured that the systems would continue to operate smoothly under the new management. It was a bittersweet moment. Belmont had been my home for years, but now, it was someone else's responsibility. The day after the acquisition was complete, I sat down with Lawrence at Devlin Systems. The company was on a new path now, one that was stable, well-documented, and ready for growth. "You did it," Lawrence said, smiling. "You turned a disaster into an opportunity." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I just did what needed to be done. In the months that followed, I led the integration of Belmont's clients into Devlin Systems. The transition was smooth, and our team grew stronger with each passing day. We began to win clients, one by one, and the reputation of Devlin Systems began to soar. The lessons I had learned over the years, the mistakes I had made and corrected, were now the foundation of something truly remarkable. One evening, as I was sitting on my deck again, watching the sunset over Lake Michigan, Sarah sat beside me. "What's next for you?" she asked softly. I smiled, a sense of calm settling in. "Next? We build something that lasts. Something better. Something that will stand the test of time." And for the first time in years, I felt certain. The work I had done, the systems I had built, the mistakes I had made and learned from, none of it was wasted. In the end, the best way to prove your worth is to move forward and build something that lasts.